In the spring of 1872, a road crew working along the Scioto River in southern Ohio broke ground on a stretch of land that had never been formally excavated. The crew foreman, a man named Ezra Daniels, whose name appears in the Pike County Road Commission records of that year, stopped work at midday and sent a rider to the nearest town. What the crew had uncovered in the riverbank was not rock, not old timber, not the kind of obstruction that road crews in southern Ohio were used to dealing with. It was a burial, and the individual in that burial, measured on site by Daniels and confirmed by two members of his crew, had a femur longer than any of them had ever seen on a human being. The estimate recorded in Daniels' own field notes, which were submitted to the Pike County Historical Office and which survive in the county archive, was 7 feet 4 inches. That is where this story begins. Not with a myth, not with a legend, with a foreman's field notes submitted to a county office, sitting in an archive that almost nobody has thought to look in for 150 years. Scioto County, the long river valley running south through the middle of Ohio toward the Ohio River. Flat-bottomed floodplains bordered by hills that rise sharply on both sides. Soil so dark and deep that early settlers described it as almost black, the kind of soil that holds what is placed in it for an extraordinarily long time. And underneath that soil, distributed across the creek bottoms and the low terraces above the river, a pattern of burial that was documented repeatedly across the second half of the 19th century by named individuals with professional standing in their communities, and that has since become, through a series of institutional decisions that were each individually defensible and collectively disastrous for the historical record, essentially invisible. Not destroyed, invisible. There is a difference. Destroyed evidence is gone. Invisible evidence is still there, in county archives and newspaper morgues, and the kind of institutional storage that exists in the gap between what is publicly accessible and what has simply never been indexed for public access. The Scioto River Valley record is invisible in that second sense. It is there. It is just not where anyone has been told to look. The first sustained documentation of unusual remains in the Scioto corridor dates to the period immediately following the Civil War, when the combination of agricultural expansion, railroad construction, and the growth of southern Ohio's river towns produced the kind of ground disturbance that turns up whatever has been waiting in the earth long enough for the earth to have forgotten it. Between 1866 and 1871, at least 4 separate accounts appeared in the Chillicothe Gazette, which was the primary newspaper of record for Ross County in the upper Scioto Valley, describing the discovery of skeletal remains of unusual size during construction or agricultural work along the river. The accounts varied in their detail. Some gave measurements, some did not. But they shared a consistent feature that sets them apart from the kind of fabrication that skeptics reflexively apply to this category of report. They named people. They named places. They named the circumstances of discovery with the specificity that comes from someone writing down what actually happened rather than what would make an interesting story. The 1866 account described remains found during the excavation of a cellar foundation on the northern edge of Chillicothe, the county seat. The construction foreman submitted a written description to the Gazette, in which he estimated the height of the individual, based on the length of the leg bones, at between 7 and 7.5 feet. He noted that the skull was intact, proportionate to the body, and of a size that he had not previously encountered in any of his years of construction work in the valley. The Gazette printed his name and his address. In 1866, in a small Ohio town, you did not put a man's name and address in a newspaper unless you expected him to be findable and willing to stand behind what he had said. The 1869 account came from a different source entirely. A physician named Dr. Harlan Webb, who maintained a practice in the town of Waverly, about 20 miles south of Chillicothe. submitted a letter to the Gazette describing remains he had personally examined after they were uncovered during the grading of a new roadbed along Paint Creek. Webb was not a credulous man. His letter makes that clear. He described his initial skepticism when the road crew sent for him, and he described in clinical detail what changed his mind. The femur he examined measured by his own tape 32 inches in length. A femur of that length corresponds to an individual height of approximately 7 feet 2 inches. Webb noted that the bone showed no signs of pathological elongation, no asymmetry, no evidence of any growth disorder that would account for the size. It was, in his professional assessment, a normal femur belonging to a normal individual who was simply of a physical scale that he had no existing framework to explain. Webb's letter ran in the Gazette. It also ran in abbreviated form in the Scioto Gazette, which served the county directly south. Webb was a physician of some standing in Pike County. He was not writing to attract attention. He was writing because he had seen something that he believed the medical and historical community should know about, and because he had no other institutional channel through which to report it. That is the thing that gets missed when this category of evidence is dismissed as newspaper sensationalism. The men generating these accounts were not trying to sell papers. They were farmers and physicians and road foremen and surveyors who encountered something they did not understand and did what people in their position did in the 19th century, which was write it down and send it to the newspaper, because the newspaper was the only public record available to them. The Smithsonian Institution existed. The Ohio Historical and Archaeological Society was beginning to organize. But neither of those institutions had a presence in southern Ohio in the 1860s that made them a realistic first contact for a road foreman with a large femur and a work crew waiting to know what to do with it. By the time those institutions did have a presence in southern Ohio, the dynamic had shifted in a way that is crucial to understanding what happened to the Scioto Valley record. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology began systematic work in the Ohio Valley in the late 1870s. Their field agents came to southern Ohio because southern Ohio had mounds. The Hopewell culture, centered in Ross County around Chillicothe, had left one of the densest concentrations of earthwork architecture in North America. The Mound City Complex, the Hopewell Mound Group, the Sipe Earthworks, these were already known to exist. The Bureau came to document and collect, and they did both at a scale that was unprecedented. Between 1878 and 1895, Bureau field agents conducted excavations at dozens of sites across Ross, Pike, and Scioto counties. The materials they collected, the bones, the artifacts, the pottery, the copperwork, moved to Washington in quantities that the receiving institution was not adequately staffed to process, with the kind of individual specificity that would have made the collection usable for future researchers. This is not a minor administrative detail. It is the mechanism by which the Scioto Valley record became invisible. When a field agent excavated a burial mound and recovered skeletal material, that material was assigned a catalog entry describing it as skeletal remains from Ross County, Ohio, or skeletal remains from Pike County Mound Complex. No individual measurements, no photographs of specific specimens, no osteological descriptions that would allow a future researcher to assess the physical characteristics of the individuals whose remains had been collected. The Chillicothe Gazette accounts, the Webb letter, the Daniels field notes. None of the specific claims made in those documents appear anywhere in the Bureau's catalog records for the Scioto Valley collections. There are three ways to understand that absence. The newspaper accounts were exaggerated, which newspapers of the period were certainly capable of. The catalog records were incomplete, which was standard practice in an era when the Bureau was collecting faster than it could process. Or the most physically significant specimens were handled differently from the general collection in ways that are not reflected in the publicly accessible catalog. All three explanations could be true simultaneously. What cannot be true is that the evidence is available for the kind of independent verification that would settle the question, because it is not. Whatever the Bureau collected from the Scioto Valley in the 1880s is in Smithsonian holdings. Those holdings have not been made accessible for independent osteological examination. The practical effect of inaccessible evidence is identical to the practical effect of destroyed evidence, regardless of the reason for the inaccessibility. There is a detail from the Scioto Valley excavations that has received almost no attention outside of the original county records, and that detail concerns the soil. In 1883, a Bureau field agent conducting work at a mound site near the town of Piketon, in Pike County, submitted a field report describing the stratigraphy of the burial deposit. The report, which survives in the Bureau's published annual summary, in a form general enough to obscure its most significant content, noted that the deepest burial level at the Piketon site was associated with a layer of fine gray silt that the agent described as consistent with alluvial deposition from a major flood event. Local geologists consulted on the report estimated that the silt layer dated to the period of significantly elevated river levels in the Scioto Valley, a period associated with post-glacial hydrological instability in the Ohio River watershed, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 years before the present. If that stratigraphic association is accurate, the individuals buried at the deepest level of the Piketon Mound were placed there not during the Hopewell period, not during the Adena period, but during a period that predates every formally recognized cultural tradition in southern Ohio by several thousand years. The Bureau's published summary did not discuss this implication. It noted the silt layer, noted the geologist's estimate, and moved on. The bones from that level were collected and shipped to Washington with the rest of the material from the site. They have not been individually described or made available for analysis since. The Shawnee, who inhabited the Scioto Valley at the time of European contact, maintained oral traditions about a people who had been in the valley before them. These traditions described the predecessors as large in body, powerful, and gone through catastrophe rather than departure. The Shawnee traditions were recorded in fragmentary form by several early Ohio historians, most notably Henry Howe, whose Historical Collections of Ohio, published in 1847, contains references to Shawnee accounts of a race of large people who built the mounds and who perished in a disaster that the Shawnee associated with a great flooding of the river valleys. Howe treated these accounts as folklore. He printed them without analysis, and they have sat in his book, which is available in any major Ohio library, without being systematically compared to the physical site record of the Scioto Valley for 175 years. The geographic specificity of the Shawnee traditions, the named river crossings, the described landscape features, the specific bends in the Scioto that appear in the accounts, overlap in several cases with the documented mound and burial locations of Ross and Pike counties. That overlap has never been formally investigated. The traditions are in Howe's book. The site records are in the county archives and the Bureau's published summaries. They have never been put in conversation with each other by any institution with the resources to do it carefully, because the institutional framework that controls the interpretation of North American prehistory decided in the 1890s that there was nothing in either source worth putting in conversation with the other. The road crew that Ezra Daniels supervised in 1872 finished their road. The stretch of riverbank they had broken open was filled in, graded, and paved over in stages across the following decades. The burial that Daniels documented on his field notes is under infrastructure now. The bones he measured are gone, dispersed into the county's informal record, which means private hands or nowhere. His field notes are in the Pike County archive in a folder that has not been cited in any published historical work. The femur that Dr. Harlan Webb measured along Paint Creek in 1869 is not in any museum. Webb died in 1891. His estate was cleared by his family. What happened to any physical specimens he may have retained from his examination is not recorded. His letter to the Chillicothe Gazette is in the newspaper's archive, which is held at the Ross County Historical Society. It has been cataloged as a historical letter. It has not been discussed in any published account of pre-contact Ohio. This is the shape of the Scioto Valley record, not dramatic disappearance, not shadowy figures removing evidence in the night. A physician's letter sitting unsighted in a county historical society. A foreman's field notes in a folder in a county archive. Bureau catalog entries too general to verify or challenge. Shawnee oral traditions printed in an 1847 book that every Ohio historian has read and none has thought to cross-reference with the physical site record. The evidence did not vanish. It became invisible through the accumulated weight of institutional indifference and the absence of any framework that would have connected these separate records into a coherent picture. That absence of framework was not accidental. It was the result of an official position established by the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology in the 1890s that pre-contact North American populations were uniform in physical type, moderate in stature, and ancestors of the living indigenous nations of the region. That position was not unreasonable, given what was then known, but it was adopted as settled conclusion rather than working hypothesis, and it functioned from that point forward as a filter that determined which evidence was worth preserving in usable form and which evidence could be filed away in terms too general for anyone to work with. The Scioto River is still there. The dark soil of the floodplain still holds what has been placed in it across 10,000 years of human presence in this valley. The crop marks that satellite imagery is now beginning to read across southern Ohio describe a landscape of earthwork, architecture far more extensive than what has been formally mapped. A landscape whose full scale has not been reckoned with by any conventional account of pre-contact Ohio civilization. The Hopewell earthworks at Mound City cover territory that required labor organization at a scale implying a population and a social structure that the standard textbook account has never fully explained. And those earthworks are the ones that survived, the ones that were built on ground high enough to escape the agricultural clearing of the 19th century. Below them, in the flood terraces of the Scioto, in the dark soil that Ezra Daniels' road crew broke open in 1872, there is a record that is older than the Hopewell tradition, older than the Adena tradition, older than anything that has been given a formal name in the academic literature of North American archaeology. That record is not gone. It is in the soil and in the county archives, and in the Shawnee traditions that Henry Howe printed in 1847, without understanding what he was printing. It is in the gray silt layer that a Bureau field agent noted in 1883, and did not follow to its conclusion. It is in the field notes of a road foreman who measured a femur in a riverbank and sent a rider to town because he did not know what else to do. Ezra Daniels finished his road. He submitted his field notes to the county office because submitting field notes was what a foreman did. He did not know that those notes would sit for 150 years without being read by anyone trying to understand what he had found. He did not know that the riverbank his crew had opened contained something that predated every history anyone had yet thought to write about the valley he was building roads through. He knew the femur was too long. He could see that with his own eyes and measure it with his own tape. He knew in the plain, practical way that a man who builds roads knows the dimensions of the materials he works with, that what he was looking at did not belong to anything in the scale of the world he had been given. He wrote it down, he filed it, and then he finished his road. The Scioto Valley is still there. The archives are still there. The silt layer is still there under the flood terrace at Piketon, undated, unanalyzed, holding whatever it has held since the river last receded to its current banks 10,000 years ago. The question that the evidence is asking has not changed in 150 years. It has just been waiting in a folder in a county archive for someone to open it and ask, what was in the ground before the road? And what would it mean for everything we think we know about this valley if we finally decided to find out?